being some of the biggest tyrants towards humanity.
And that, believe it or not, is Canada in 2022 under Justin Trudeau, a man who calls himself a Liberal politician, cracking down on peaceful protesters in a way that's never been seen before, at least not in Canada. Using the Emergencies Act for the first time since it was created, he appears to have crushed the so-called Freedom Convoy protests in the capital, which has been going on for the past 3 weeks. The protesters, mostly truckers, wanted Trudeau to end the vaccine mandate he imposed on them last month. Police finally cleared them out over the weekend, and Trudeau appears to have beaten them. But at what cost? Civil liberties groups say he's destroying Canada's democracy. If this were happening somewhere in Eastern Europe, the mainstream media in the West would be calling it an assault on democracy, led by an old-school authoritarian hardman, a Lukashenko, a Putin. But it's not. It's happening in Canada, and the Prime Minister is a Liberal politician and darling of the establishment media, who are acting like everything is normal.
Comprehensive live coverage of the police action.
Residents of Ottawa are breathing a sigh of relief.
The trucks are out of the downtown core.
But this is not normal. On February the 14th, Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act for the first time since it was passed 35 years ago.
The police will be given more tools to restore order in places where public assemblies can constitute illegal and dangerous activities. It has to stop.
That was Monday. By the weekend, it would all be over. Using their new powers, the police in Ottawa moved decisively to end the 3-week-old protest in the capital. They arrested the leaders of the Freedom Convoy, including truck driver Chris Barber and later Tamara Lynch.
See you soon, Tamara. Hold the line. Hold the line.
They also arrested around 200 truckers and protesters, for the most part peaceful men and women who complied quickly with police orders. Ottawa's new interim police chief, Steve Bell, is a tough guy with tough words.
We've been bolstering our resources, developing clear plans, and preparing to take action. The action is imminent.
He wasn't bluffing. People have been dragged out of their trucks and caravans, and mounted police have been filmed trampling over at least one woman.
Hey, stand down! Oh my gosh! Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness! You trampled on the lady!
For the Trudeau government, arrests are not enough. They're using the Emergencies Act to freeze the protesters' bank accounts. The finance minister announced with relish how the measures work.
We are today serving notice. If your truck is being used in these illegal blockades, your corporate accounts will be frozen. The insurance on your vehicle will be suspended. Send your semi-trailers home.
Even people who just donated to the Freedom Convoy are being targeted. The Justice Minister, who completed the trio on Valentine's Day, compared them to terrorists on national TV.
We already do this with respect to terrorist financing. We already do this with respect to money laundering. What we are doing is extending the same kinds of principles and procedures to this situation.
You just compared people who may have donated to this to the same people who are funding maybe a terrorist. I just want to be clear here, sir. This is really important. A lot of folks say, look, I just don't like your vaccine mandates and I donated to this. Now it's illegal. Should I be worried that the bank can freeze my account? What's your answer to that?
Well, I think if you are a member of a pro-Trump movement who's donating hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars to this kind of thing, then you ought to be worried.
What if you're a Canadian citizen who donated $500 to it?
Well, I think if you're a tractor trailer owner whose employee has taken the truck and that has been sitting here in Ottawa for 3 weeks, and perhaps you gave that person permission, you may now actually lose your trucking license.
What's weird is that Canada has had to deal with dozens of actual terrorist attacks in the recent past, but the Emergencies Act was never invoked. Its predecessor, the War Measures Act, was only ever used 3 times in its long history. In World War I, World War II, and finally in 1970 by Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, who, as Prime Minister, was confronting a violent Quebec separatist group.
Well, there's a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is go on and bleed, but it's more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people who don't like the looks of a soldier.
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Well, just watch me. Just watch me.
While Pierre Trudeau faced a dangerous group which was bombing and kidnapping people, his son, half a century later, is using emergency powers against truck drivers who were guilty of little more than blowing their horns at an ungodly hour. They stopped doing even that after a court order. Their occupation no doubt caused enormous financial disruption and financial hardship, but they were almost entirely peaceful. There were a handful of shameful incidents reported, though, a war memorial disrespected, and a swastika flown by someone who may or may not have gate-crashed. But unlike the BLM protests across the border, there has not been a single death. Canadian civil liberties groups believe that Trudeau is threatening Canada's democracy, and they plan to take him to court.
The government has brought in an extreme measure that should be reserved for national emergencies, a legal standard that has not been met. Emergency powers cannot and must not be normalized.
In Parliament, Conservative politicians make a similar argument.
Any limitations to Canadians' fundamental freedoms must be justified and must meet a legal criteria. Experts across the country have said these requirements have not been met. The Prime Minister hasn't given Canadians a clear reason why he's invoking the Emergencies Act. In fact, things are de-escalating as we speak. So why is the Prime Minister using this hammer on Canadians? Isn't it true he's doing it just to save his own political skin?
The threshold was met for the Emergencies Act, and now across the country, police of jurisdiction have the tools necessary to keep people safe.
Later in this same session, an under-pressure Trudeau said something outrageous when confronted by another Conservative politician.
When did the Prime Minister lose his way? When did it happen?
You're right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Conservative Party members can stand with people who wave swastikas. They can stand with people who wave the Confederate flag. We will choose to stand with Canadians who deserve to be able to get to their jobs, who be able to get their lives back. These illegal protests need to stop, and they will, Mr. Speaker.
I am a strong Jewish woman and a member of this House and a descendant of Holocaust survivors, and I have never it's never been singled out, and I have never been made to feel less, except for today when the Prime Minister accused me of standing with swastikas. I think he owes me an apology. I'd like an apology, and I think he owes an apology to all members of this House.
I don't know how any member of the government caucus can stand by this Prime Minister when he accuses honourable members of this House of standing with a swastika. I'm calling on all members of the Liberal caucus to denounce the Prime Minister. I have given him 2 chances to apologize. He has refused to apologize. Mr. Prime Minister, apologize.
Trudeau's critics argue that he could have avoided all of this drama if he had just listened to the truckers in the first place. They wanted him to get rid of the vaccine mandate his government imposed on them on January the 15th. 90% of them were already vaccinated. They wondered, why was it necessary to compel the remaining drivers to get the jab or lose their job?
People should be able to make their own choice to take the needle or not take the needle and not lose the job, not lose their house, not lose their income, just for the vaccination.
But Trudeau refused to address their concerns.
There is always a right to protest peacefully that I and others will defend fully as part of this democracy. There is not a right to incite violence, to perform acts of violence, or to spew hatred. The small fringe minority do not represent the views of Canadians.
That is an interesting line coming from a man who lost the popular vote at the last election. His Liberal Party came in second to the Conservatives, but thanks to Canada's electoral system, the Liberals still picked up the most seats in Parliament and managed to form a minority government. 32.6% is the lowest proportion of the popular vote for a governing party in Canada's history.
Merci, mes amis.
As for his allegations that the protesters were racist, again, he opens himself up to accusations of hypocrisy. In 2019, as he was campaigning for his second term in office, it was revealed that he dressed up in blackface, not once, not twice, but at least 3 times before he entered politics.
It was something that I didn't think was racist at the time, but now I recognize it was something racist to do, and I am deeply sorry.
Have you since been made aware or remembered of other instances, and if so, how many?
I think it is obvious that this is something that was deeply regrettable. I am wary of being definitive about this because the recent pictures that came out, I had not remembered.
There will be Canadians whose lives are blighted by this crackdown. Arrests may lead to prosecution and criminal records. Working class lives, already tough, will be made yet harder. By contrast, Justin Trudeau, the son of a Prime Minister, always manages to shrug off his misdeeds. Canada's Ethics Committee has investigated him several times and found that he'd contravened the Conflict of Interest Act twice. First, for taking free holidays with the billionaire Aga Khan on his private island in the Bahamas. Particularly sensitive, as Canada's government gives the Aga Khan's foundation millions of dollars.
How could it not have occurred to you that that might not have been okay?
No. The fact is, we work sorry, let me just try to reorder the thoughts. We worked with the lobby conflict of interest commissioner on a regular basis on a broad range of issues when the issues come up. On this issue of a family vacation with a personal friend, it wasn't considered that there would be an issue there.
The second time he was caught by the Ethics Committee, it was for putting political pressure on the Attorney General during a corruption investigation. Jody Wilson-Raybould was the first Indigenous woman to hold the post, and Trudeau pushed her out of the Liberal Party soon after she complained about him in public. But he did manage to issue this rather non-apology.
First off, I want to thank the Ethics Commissioner for his report. And even though I disagree with some of his conclusions, I fully accept this report and take responsibility for everything that happened.
If some Canadians are worried about where their country is heading with vaccine mandates and COVID passports, if they don't trust their Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, it is perhaps because he has given them reason to doubt. This former drama teacher's performance is convincing fewer and fewer Canadians than ever.
In a democracy, you can protest, you can share your opinion at the top of your lungs. You can disagree with elected officials, you can certainly disagree with me. Let's cherish the democracy that we have, and let's commit ourselves every day to working together to make it even better. Merci.
Well, let's bring in our guest now. David Craig, reporter at Bridge City News. He's been covering the protests day and night. Stockwell Day, a former leader of the Canadian Alliance. You could describe him as a conservative politician. Isaiah Bullard, a US truck driver, has some concerns about mandates on both sides of the border. And finally, Steve Hewitt, an expert in Canadian politics and security at Birmingham University. Steve Hewitt, we'll start with you. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association is taking Trudeau to court over invoking the Emergencies Act. Is the Prime Minister a threat to Canadian democracy?
I wouldn't go so far to say he's a threat to Canadian democracy, but I think it's quite troubling that they've invoked the Emergencies Act. And I mean, there's a great irony. I'm a historian, actually, and the great irony is that Trudeau's father is infamous for invoking the War Measures Act in October 1970 over 2 kidnappings in the province of Quebec. And that is a legacy that haunted him effectively the rest of his life. And now you have this emergency situation just over 50 years later, where the replacement for the War Measures Act is the Emergencies Act has now been invoked by Justin Trudeau. And I think the Canadian Civil Liberties Association is right to sue over this. I think it's quite troubling. I have to say, I don't approve of the protests. I completely disagree with the protests. I think it's right that it's been pointed out that some of the leaders of the protests are far-right extremists. but I also defend the right of people to peacefully protest.
Well, here's my question for you then,
believe
Steve. Following from that, people looking from the outside, they hear that Trudeau is a Liberal politician. He was supported in Parliament for invoking the Act by another Liberal caucus, a bloc party, if you like. What's going on when the Liberals in Canada aren't supporting the working classes in their right to protest? What's going on? Are they Liberals really?
Well, the irony is that the group that supported Trudeau and the Liberals was the New Democratic Party, the NDP. In 1970, they were the only group that opposed the War Measures Act in the federal parliament. So they've gone. So I do worry, and I say this as a progressive, I do worry that sometimes people are supportive of protests that they agree with and opposed to protests they don't like. And I think that on a personal level is troubling.
That's a really good point because, Justin Trudeau has for years put himself forward as someone who empathizes with everyone, Indigenous people, ethnic minorities, refugees, transgender people, you name it, he empathizes with them. In these circumstances, he turned into a hard man. Why?
Again, I think it's several things. I mean, I think this became very personal for him during the federal election last September. The vilification of Trudeau, I think, again, it's the Canadian politics has taken on a very American tone in the last few years. There was a rally where someone threw gravel at him. The rhetoric is very directed at Trudeau, even though obviously we're in a parliamentary system. We're not in a presidential system. And so actually Trudeau is part of a government. But we very much, it's so focused on him. It's been very personalized for him. And I think he's responded in kind with overheated rhetoric that has tarred all of the protesters, even the non-extremists, with the same brush.
It's kind of getting like that in the United Kingdom as well, where you're beginning to think that Boris Johnson is the government, is becoming presidential. Stockwell Day, the threshold for bringing in the Emergencies Act, invoking the Emergencies Act, is that there are many, but one of them is that there are no existing laws to deal with what's happening. And yet we've seen the Ambassador Bridge cleared with the existing laws. I mean, are there existing laws enough to deal with those protests?
No, not as it sits. First, I want to say quickly, your network is one of the few I've seen that is bringing people on for discussion that have opposing and divergent views. So congratulate you for that. In Canada, you cannot, on mainstream media, hear any view other than the talking points of the Prime Minister. Unfortunately, other than, I'm not referring to David here, mainstream media just regurgitate the talking points. And you are quite right. The problem was solved. The blockades had been removed. They were gone. Trade was flowing back and forth across the border. And it was after that that the government brought in this Emergencies Act, which is a nuclear bomb to try and fix what a fly swatter had already fixed. Your viewers need to know that not only was, of course, everybody was forcibly cleared. Bank accounts across the country are now being seized and closed. Yesterday, the head of the RCMP, which used to report to me when I was Minister of Public Safety, put out a call to all citizens to inform the police if they think any of their neighbors are saying anything, I quote, against the authority of the government. People, one of the women who was one of the key truck drivers in this movement is being held without bail. We let murderers.
You're talking about Tamara Lich.
Bail. She's being without bail. This is a nuclear bomb when a fly swatter was working. It is completely out of control.
You're talking about Tamara Lich in this case.
That's correct. She was arrested. And remember, the only crimes, there's been a grand media smear on this thing about extremism and all of that. Those were talking point lies. The mainstream media, I can tell you, I was getting daily reports from the front lines. So, I know some of the people out there, they have lied about this.
Let's talk about the charges.
Is outrageous.
Let's talk about the charges. In Britain, probably in America, it seems incredibly quaint that people would be charged with mischief. It doesn't sound like something you'd use the Emergencies Act to handle. Mischief, what is that?
Well, mischief is basically doing anything that is causing mischief, and it is meant to be seen as low level, but you don't want mischief makers at inopportune times. You don't want somebody running through, let's say, a November 11th ceremony on Parliament Hill and disrupting things. So mischief is there. But mischief now has been raised to almost the equivalent of a capital crime just with this particular act. So if it's mischief, it can go as far as your bank account being seized and you being held indefinitely in jail.
Well, isn't that what the Charter of Rights is for in Canada? Why don't you have recourse to that?
The Charter of Rights, which was brought in by Trudeau's father, has some admirable points to it. All of those points have been crushed. They have been ridden over roughshod. There are no more rights. There are no, and people think we're exaggerating or that we're over exaggerating this. You do not have the right to speak out against the government in Canada. Your bank account, as many have, will be seized. You have a very high possibility of being arrested. The Charter of Rights is now virtually non-existent.
It's incredible. David, I need to move on to you. You've moved back home now. You were covering the protests on the ground, night and day, 16-hour days and so on. Is it over now?
Yeah, the streets are completely clear. Police have occupied the area, to use that term on purpose. They have actually created a bit more of a blockade than what the actual protests did in the time it was there. I know they have been moving down to smaller streets, but it is eerily quiet in Ottawa, with several checkpoints all over, to the point where majority of independent journalists could not even get through onto unused streets where they were walking day in, day out, that were not at all covered by the convoy. So it definitely has finished and it's very quiet right now.
We've heard that they're going to regroup in some way. Are they?
That, in my opinion, doesn't really mean much right now. They are so fractioned off, and I think with the leadership being arrested and figuring out that issue, there is no core central leadership to regroup in the way that it originally arrived in Ottawa.
And you said that Tamara Lich, one of the leaders, is not being granted bail. So these are extraordinary measures. What's happening to the rule of law in Canada?
Yeah, I just want to add to that. To draw into a comparison, there was a protest in Winnipeg that happened as well. And there was a man that was considered, he actually tried to run over 4 people. He hit 2 people, sent them to the hospital. During the protest while Ottawa was happening, he's been released on bail, just to draw a comparison to someone like Tamara Lich, which 5 minutes before she was arrested was out taking pictures with children. I'm just trying to draw the stark comparison of a message being sent and that the unequal rule of law coming down on people. So
what you're saying, David, what you're saying is it's politics entering into the judicial system.
Oh, it's entered. It's already entered for sure.
Can I bring in Isaiah Bullard now? We're coming towards the end of the program. Isaiah, you're an American truck driver, but you've been following these protests very closely because obviously on your side of the border, you're also subjected to vaccine mandates. Did it break your heart to see the Freedom Convoy broken up like this?
Oh, it definitely did. It started and remained peaceful the entire time. And what Justin Trudeau said was, at first, it was a fringe minority. Well, what some fringe minority it turned out to be when he goes out and invokes the Emergencies Act, effectively disbanding the peaceful protest. And this is something that I agree with because I agree with the protest, not the Emergencies Act, because it remained peaceful and it exposed the Canadian government to these, what I would say, extreme measures that they would inflict on people. That was at first an extreme, a fringe minority. It was never a fringe minority. It was at what I suppose to be 50,000 trucks and people just showing up, and all they wanted was dialogue with Justin Trudeau. But he turned tail, he cleared off and ran away, and then he comes back with all of this. And that's just something that I don't agree with.
Isaiah, just the headline figure that you mentioned there, 50,000 trucks, I mean, that was most likely an exaggeration. I can't be sure. It's very hard to tell what these numbers are, but I believe they were significantly smaller. One last question, Isaiah, before we close the program. You, on your side of the border, are being told that you must have the vaccine or you won't be able to work, basically, across borders anyway. What are your plans?
Well, I'm not going to get the vaccine. I'm vehemently against mandates in general. I've had the coronavirus, so I have natural immunity. But even before and after, I've considered the vaccine. The problem is when it becomes mandated, that on principle I just won't do it, because when something is mandated, you effectively set a precedent for the government to you effectively give precedent for the government to have more power over you, and that's just something that I don't agree with.
Isaiah Bullard, Steve Hewitt, Stockwell Day, David Craig. Sorry it's been a short debate, but thank you for your contributions to the Nexus. Much appreciated, and thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, if you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Until next week then, goodbye.